Games and game boards that represent historical events have been around for a couple thousand years. These are usually about conflict, either representing actual events or generic conflicts of some kind. Some are quite abstract, like the Roman game La Tronculi or Chaturanga from India. That's about 1400 years old now. Others are more specific, like Tablut, for instance, which is sometimes called the Swedes and Muscovites. On the island nation of Japan, their history has been recorded in a unique way. It's a board game form that's called e-sugoroku. Before we get started, my humble apologies to our Japanese friends for my bad pronunciation of Japanese words. This video is about this book, From Shogun to Godzilla, a graphic game board history of modern Japan by Norman Brosterman. Norman has been a collector of many things: art, educational materials, historical items. I worked with Norman on this book, The History of Kindergarten, Inventing Kindergarten, several years ago, and he contacted me earlier this year to help him produce this new book. The book documents a portion of his collection of e-sugoroku games, their artists, the publishers, a little bit about the history and how they're played, and altogether 92 of his games are represented in the pages of this book. That's about a third of his actual collection. Be sure to follow the links in the notes below, and you can get a copy for yourself and learn a little bit more about the subject. The word e-sugoroku translates directly as double six, as in a pair of dice. It refers to two different kinds of Japanese game: ban-sugoroku, which is played on a board, like Go, or Gomoku, or those kinds of board games, and e-sugoroku, which are these paper games that are represented in the book. They're not really a board game because there's not a board, not a rigid board. They're printed generally on pieces of paper. The earliest sugoroku were printed on paper with wood blocks, and the path around the game board were sacred texts, and they were used to teach young Buddhist monks about the path they were following. In the early Edo period, that would be from the 1600s to the 1800s, they were adopted for the laypersons to play the game and to also learn morality, tales, and lessons of history. They've been published in newspapers and magazines, but they were also folded and inserted into decorative envelopes to go along with the games and sold that way. The earliest example in the book dates back to the 1860s. The most recent example is 1960s. So these pages represent about 100 years of that history. Most of the games are a simple roll and move style. A few of them have cards for events and hazards and so on. Most of the hazards are right on the board. Most of the rewards are right on the board, very much like the Game of Goose and that ilk. Quite a bit like the old Snakes and Ladders, the Gayan Chapur game from India, with its morality tales, rewards, and penalties. One thing to look for on these boards, almost all of them have, and you'll see them in this slideshow I'm going to do in just a second, and that is this kanji character. This basically is a character that means end goal, the finish line, the conclusion of the adventure that's represented on the game board. So let's look at a few examples here. This is the earliest example in the book, published in the 1860s. It's a beautiful woodblock print with amazing colors, depicting many forms of travel on a spiral towards the innermost image. Admiral Perry had arrived at Edo Bay in July of 1853, and this visit signaled the opening of Japan to Western trade, and the features of Western culture and technology as shown in the spaces on this game board. The War of the Qing Dynasty. The lower right corner here shows negotiations in the Imperial Palace in July of 1894 that ended this war with China. The Japanese were creating panel stories in what we would call a graphic novel style, long before the age of manga. It's not clear what the game's path is supposed to be around these panels, but I'm guessing it's a zigzag route. This game from the year 1900 deals with morality tales much like the Gaian Shorpur from India and the Game of Goose in Europe. The path is fairly clear. The final space is at the top center. You can also see numbers and symbols on the spaces, which I assume indicates jump points to other spaces or events that occur in subsequent landings on each space. It's a classic path to success sort of objective. Here we see a boy traveling in this curious flying machine in 1912. It's sort of a dreamlike adventure that reminds me of Winsor McCay's Little Nemo in Slumberland, which was published in the Sunday Funnies in the U.S. This game was geared more towards youth, but there's still some reference to the military action so familiar to the Japanese. Conquest of the Sky. Here's a proud display of the latest weaponry from 1918. Airships, biplanes, balloons, parachutes, cannons, even mustard gas. Some very interesting training exercises are shown near the center that looks more like a circus act than a military discipline. This is the first one in the book to use Arabic numerals to convey the sequence of spaces in the game. I assume we're all aware of the prominence of baseball in Japan. I think many assume it's due to American influence after World War II, but the Japanese have been playing baseball almost since its invention in the mid-19th century. In 1873, an American teacher named Horace Wilson is said to organize their first team. This e-sugoroku was published in 1923. Somewhat in contrast to that, this game was also published in 1923. It shows creative activities being pursued by schoolgirls. The crafts they're working with are actually early kindergarten lessons developed by Friedrich Froebel in Germany in the 1830s. These educational tools are still quite popular in Asia and Europe, and were the foundation of kindergarten in America. Many of the movies being produced in the U.S. found their way to Japan in the 1920s. Silent movie fans will recognize Buster Keaton, Charlie Chaplin, Harold Lloyd, and Ben Turpin. We can also see cameras and directors behind the scenes. No language barrier when the soundtrack is instrumental. They just replaced the dialogue cards with Japanese translations. Norakuro, the Army Dog, began as a comic strip in 1931 and is still popular in Japan. He was sort of their version of Felix the Cat. Again, the prominence of wartime heroism is much revered in Japan's history. Now this looks like a race game. Published in 1939, the game traces the route of the Nippon Go, the first Japanese airplane to circumnavigate the world. The plane was a Mitsubishi G3M long-range bomber modified for the trip. I really like this projection of the Earth's continents, not something you see very often. And the various points they visited on the journey tell us a lot about the world at that time. But Norman's caption says that the European leg of the flight was actually a bit different than shown on the Gameboard. World War II was beginning to get real. This 1942 e-sugoroku follows the military careers of 5 young men, shown in the lower right corner. Each pursues a different role in the military as they train and serve for the glory of the empire. Of course, we all know how that turned out. The smiling faces of the children tell it all in this 1953 game. Symbols of former enemies, happy and prosperous children, signs of peace all round. 2 features of this e-sugoroku stand out to me. One is the small circles with arrangements of pips like dice faces. Not sure how this was used in playing the game, but it's interesting. The other is the gentleman in the lower right corner. This is Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida, who was instrumental in the post-war relationship with the U.S. Is that Godzilla I see in space number 6? This mid-1950s game was a review of so many sci-fi standards, both Japanese and American, that it's a game in itself to identify as many iconic scenes as possible. The big bads include the usual products of the atomic age: giant spiders, kaiju crustaceans, and of course, the direct ancestor of the atomic dinosaur we all know and love. In 1960, at the dawn of our modern manga heroes, this Sugoroku features a costumed sci-fi superhero. Adventures abound with alien monsters, landscapes, and spaceships. And again, Godzilla makes an appearance in frame number 9. As I mentioned before, many of these Sugoroku were purchased in a colorful envelope. This space exploration game came in this wrapper. Here are just a few other examples of these envelopes. A detective theme. More movie characters. Scenes of war, and war, and war. And finally, some less violent subject matter. Games from Japan's fascinating history. This is just a sample of the collection, as I mentioned. There's so much more backstory to this subject matter. They're interesting games, but beautiful artwork. A great representation of history from the Japanese point of view. Some that's blatantly propagandist, and others that are definitely just fun. You got to get the book. That'll tell you a lot more about what's involved here. So another thanks to Norman Brosterman for allowing me to be involved in this project. It was a fascinating look into some games that, of course, I hadn't seen before, which is always a little adventure in itself, of course. And so I invite you to check it out. Whether you play Sugoroku or some other game, Japanese or not, you know what I always say, be sure to play every day.